Let's start. Number 1. Slathering honey on a cut sounds like something a medieval peasant would do before dying of an infected hangnail. Grandma dabbing it on scraped knees while doctors roll their eyes and prescribe something with a longer name. Here's the part that makes those doctors look genuinely foolish. Modern clinical medicine has fully rehabilitated honey as a legitimate wound treatment, and it is not even remotely controversial anymore among wound care specialists. The antimicrobial power comes from three simultaneous mechanisms working at once. First, honey's low water content starves bacteria of the moisture they need to survive. Second, its naturally acidic pH, sitting between 3.2 and 4.5, creates a chemical environment that most pathogens simply cannot tolerate. Third, an enzyme called glucose oxidase produces a slow, continuous release of hydrogen peroxide directly at the wound site, which keeps killing bacteria long after the initial application. Manuka honey goes even further, containing an additional compound called methylglyoxal that remains fully antibacterial even when the hydrogen peroxide mechanism is neutralized, making it effective against strains that conventional antiseptics sometimes struggle against. The NHS in the United Kingdom and multiple European wound care bodies have formally approved medical-grade honey dressings for treating chronic wounds, surgical incisions, and burns. This is not fringe medicine. This is a product your insurance company knows about. A 2015 Cochrane review, the gold standard of evidence synthesis in medicine, analyzed multiple trials and found honey dressings reduced healing time in mild to moderate burns and outperformed some conventional dressings in specific wound types. Honey also creates a moist wound environment, which modern wound science now recognizes as critical for cellular regeneration, while simultaneously preventing bacterial biofilm formation. The sticky armor that makes chronic wound infections nearly impossible to treat with standard antibiotics. Ancient Egyptian medical texts from 2000 BCE document honey wound applications. The Greeks, the Romans, and Ayurvedic practitioners all arrived at the same conclusion independently. They were not being folksy. They were observing consistent results across thousands of years of application. The irony is that modern hospitals spent decades replacing honey with synthetic antiseptics, then watched antibiotic-resistant infections explode, and are now quietly putting honey back into their wound care protocols. Your grandmother did not need a double-blind trial. She had 4,000 years of observation. Science eventually caught up, put on a lab coat, and published a paper confirming what the beekeeper already knew. Number 2. Sipping ginger tea when your stomach is staging a full revolt sounds exactly like the kind of advice dispensed by people who also think crystals cure anxiety. Charming, probably useless, definitely accompanied by a hand-knitted blanket and an opinion about essential oils. Except ginger is one of the most clinically validated antiemetic agents on the planet, and the evidence base is deep enough that oncologists and obstetricians now formally recommend it to some of their most medically vulnerable patients. The active compounds responsible are gingerols and shogaols, phenolic compounds that do something genuinely sophisticated. They influence the gastrointestinal tract and the central nervous system at the same time. They accelerate gastric emptying, which reduces the uncomfortable fullness sensation that triggers nausea, and they block serotonin receptors in the gut lining that initiate the vomiting reflex. That is not one mechanism. That is a coordinated two-front biological intervention from a root you can buy at a grocery store. A landmark review published in Obstetrics and Gynecology in 2005 analyzed multiple randomized controlled trials and concluded that ginger was significantly more effective than placebo for pregnancy-related nausea and morning sickness, with a safety profile appropriate for pregnant patients, a population for whom pharmaceutical antiemetics raise serious concerns. In chemotherapy-induced nausea, one of the most pharmacologically resistant and quality-of-life destroying side effects of cancer treatment, ginger supplementation has shown measurable benefit in reducing acute nausea severity across multiple trials, including a large multi-center study funded by the National Cancer Institute. Motion sickness studies consistently showed ginger outperforming placebo, with some comparative trials showing performance comparable to certain pharmaceutical antihistamines, minus the drowsiness that makes those drugs impractical for people who need to function normally. Traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, ancient Greek medicine, and medieval European herbalism all independently arrived at ginger for gastrointestinal complaints. Independent convergence across completely separate medical traditions on separate continents over thousands of years is a signal that should have attracted serious scientific attention far earlier than it did. The effective dose in most trials ranges from 1 to 1.5 grams of ginger daily. Achievable through food, standardized supplements, or concentrated tea, making this one of the most accessible evidence-based interventions that exists. Pharmaceutical researchers have studied isolated gingerol compounds as templates for developing synthetic antiemetic drugs, meaning the industry that spent decades dismissing the root is now reverse engineering it. Ginger did not need to be discovered. It needed science to stop being too proud to read the notes every grandmother on 6 continents had already left. Number 3. Rubbing garlic on things, or eating it by the fistful to fight off sickness, sounds like the kind of advice that also functions as an extremely effective social distancing strategy. Superstition with a strong personal radius and a tendency to clear rooms. But garlic contains one of the most pharmacologically active naturally occurring antimicrobial compounds ever identified. And the research confirming it spans microbiology, immunology, and cardiovascular medicine simultaneously. When raw garlic is crushed or chopped, a sulfur compound called allicin converts, via the enzyme alliinase, into allicin. This reaction only occurs when the cell walls are ruptured, which is why whole, uncrushed garlic has significantly weaker effects. The chemistry is triggered by physical damage, like a biological alarm system arming itself when the perimeter is breached. Allicin demonstrates broad-spectrum antimicrobial activity in laboratory settings against bacteria, fungi, and certain viruses. It works by inhibiting sulfhydryl-containing enzymes that are critical to pathogen metabolism, essentially disabling the biological machinery that allows microorganisms to survive and replicate. A randomized controlled trial published in Advances in Therapy in 2001 found that participants taking a standardized allicin supplement had significantly fewer colds over a 12-week period than the placebo group and recovered faster when they did get sick. Ancient use is extraordinary in scope. Egyptian workers building the pyramids were reportedly given garlic as a performance-enhancing staple. The physician Hippocrates prescribed it for pulmonary complaints and infections in the 5th century BCE. Louis Pasteur, the father of germ theory himself, documented garlic's antibacterial properties in 1858. Albert Schweitzer used it to treat dysentery in Africa when pharmaceutical alternatives were unavailable. During both World War I and World War II, military physicians applied garlic directly to wounds as an antiseptic when conventional supplies ran short. This was not desperation folklore. It was observed to reduce infection rates, and the mechanism is now fully understood. Beyond antimicrobial effects, aged garlic extract has demonstrated immunomodulatory effects in clinical trials, specifically increasing the activity of natural killer cells and gamma delta T cells, which are frontline components of the immune system's rapid response capacity. The cardiovascular evidence is entirely separate, but equally compelling. Multiple meta-analyses have found meaningful reductions in blood pressure and LDL cholesterol from standardized garlic supplementation, a fact well established enough that some cardiologists now mention it in patient consultations. Garlic was doing antimicrobial chemistry before science had a word for antimicrobial. The germs retreated, the scientific establishment eventually followed, and the garlic has been there the entire time. Number 4, the idea that a bowl of soup constitutes medical treatment sounds sweet when a parent says it and slightly embarrassing when you repeat it to a physician. Warm liquid and noodles as a clinical intervention. Surely this is the fond, nutritionally irrelevant ritual of every caring household rather than a pharmacologically coherent treatment. Except chicken soup has been subjected to actual laboratory analysis and peer-reviewed clinical observation, and what researchers found is specific, measurable, and genuinely relevant to what happens in your body during a respiratory infection. A study published in Chess The Journal of the American College of Chest Physicians by pulmonologist Stephen Rennard at the University of Nebraska Medical Center found that chicken soup inhibited neutrophil chemotaxis in laboratory conditions. Neutrophil chemotaxis is the migration of white blood cells to inflamed tissue, the biological process that drives the upper respiratory congestion, mucus overproduction, and swollen sensation that makes a cold so miserable. The anti-inflammatory effect was present in both homemade and commercially prepared versions, though it varied by recipe, suggesting the mechanism comes from a combination of ingredients rather than any single component. Hot liquid intake generally increases nasal mucus velocity, the rate at which the mucus lining of the nasal passages clears pathogens and debris, compared to cold or room temperature water. Chicken soup was shown to be more effective at this than plain hot water alone, suggesting that specific compounds beyond mere thermal effect are biologically active. Cysteine, an amino acid released from chicken protein during prolonged cooking, is chemically similar to acetylcysteine, a pharmaceutical compound used as a mucolytic agent in clinical medicine to thin and loosen mucus. The parallel is not a coincidence, it is the same chemistry arriving through a different preparation method. The documented history of chicken soup as medicine predates the Roman Empire. The Egyptian physician and philosopher Maimonides, writing in the 12th century, formally prescribed chicken broth for respiratory ailments in his medical texts. Steam from hot soup provides direct humidification of inflamed nasal and bronchial passages, reducing the mechanical discomfort of breathing and potentially inhibiting rhinovirus replication efficiency, since those viruses prefer slightly cooler and drier environments. The psychological dimensions also matter. Warmth, familiar taste, and being cared for have measurable effects on immune parameters through stress hormone reduction, and lower cortisol directly improves immune function. Chicken soup is not magic. It is a pharmaceutical delivery vehicle in edible form that your immune system, your inflamed sinuses, and your stress response all benefit from at the same time. The fact that it also tastes good is just nature being unusually generous. Number 5. Turmeric as medicine sounds like the opening line of a wellness blogger's origin story. Golden lattes, vague promises of anti-inflammatory properties, and an aggressive opinion about seed oils. The whole spice aisle dressed up as a pharmacy and charging accordingly. Except the anti-inflammatory mechanism of curcumin, turmeric's primary bioactive compound, is one of the most extensively studied in natural product pharmacology. And the molecular target it acts on is the same one several major pharmaceutical drugs were specifically designed to block. Curcumin inhibits NF-kappa B, a protein complex that functions as a master regulator of inflammatory gene expression in the human body. When NF-kappa B is overactive, as it is in chronic inflammatory conditions, it drives the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines that cause tissue swelling, pain, and progressive damage. Many pharmaceutical anti-inflammatory drugs work on pathways that feed directly into this system. Curcumin also inhibits TOX2, the enzyme that produces prostaglandins, the exact same enzyme targeted by ibuprofen and other non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. It works through a different binding mechanism than pharmaceuticals, but the downstream effect on inflammatory signaling is comparable. Multiple randomized controlled trials in patients with osteoarthritis have found curcumin supplementation produces pain and mobility improvements statistically comparable to ibuprofen with significantly fewer gastrointestinal side effects, a meaningful clinical distinction since NSAID-induced gut damage is a serious and underreported medical problem. The critical limitation is bioavailability. Curcumin is poorly absorbed from the gut in its standard form. However, combining it with piperine, the active compound in black pepper, increases bioavailability by approximately 2,000%, according to a study published in Planta Medica. Traditional Indian cooking has combined turmeric and black pepper in spice blends for thousands of years. They did not know the biochemistry. The biochemistry was happening regardless. Ayurvedic medicine has used turmeric for at least 4,000 years for wound healing, digestive complaints, and joint pain. Traditional Chinese medicine adopted it independently. These were not cultural coincidences. They were consistent observations of a biological effect across populations separated by geography and centuries. Over 100 human trials involving curcumin are registered on clinicaltrials.gov, covering conditions from metabolic syndrome to inflammatory bowel disease to certain cancers. This is not a wellness trend with a turmeric-stained blender. This is a heavily investigated compound that traditional medicine was using correctly long before the clinical trial existed to confirm it. Number 6. Drinking mint tea after a meal because it helps digestion sounds exactly like the sort of thing people say while wearing linen at a farmer's market. Aggressively gentle, medically unverifiable, and accompanied by an opinion about sourdough fermentation. Peppermint as pharmacology seems like a stretch until you look at what menthol, its primary active compound, actually does inside the gastrointestinal tract. Menthol activates calcium channels in smooth muscle cells, lining the digestive system, specifically L-type calcium channels. This activation causes smooth muscle relaxation, reducing the involuntary spasms and abnormal contractions that drive the cramping, bloating, and pain characteristic of gut disorders. That is not a warming sensation or a placebo. That is a documented cellular mechanism with a named molecular target. Irritable bowel syndrome affects a significant portion of the global population and has historically been undertreated because pharmaceutical options with acceptable side effect profiles are genuinely limited. Peppermint oil in enteric-coated capsules, designed to bypass the stomach and release specifically in the intestine, is now listed as an evidence-supported treatment in multiple international gastroenterology guidelines, including those of the British Society of Gastroenterology. A meta-analysis published in the Journal of Clinical Gastroenterology analyzed multiple randomized controlled trials and found enteric-coated peppermint oil capsules significantly superior to placebo for reducing irritable bowel syndrome abdominal pain, with effect sizes large enough to be clinically meaningful rather than statistically technical. The enteric coating is critical and illustrates exactly how traditional folk use differs from pharmaceutical optimization. Plain peppermint oil without coating relaxes the lower esophageal sphincter and can worsen acid reflux. Delivery method matters enormously. The traditional cup of tea captures some benefit. The clinical capsule optimizes it precisely. Beyond gut applications, peppermint oil has demonstrated efficacy in reducing chemotherapy-induced nausea and post-operative nausea in clinical settings. Topical peppermint application, specifically a 10% peppermint oil solution applied to the forehead, has been evaluated in randomized trials for tension headaches and found to perform comparably to acetaminophen in pain reduction scores, through menthol's activation of cold-sensitive receptors that modulate pain signaling. Historical documentation of medicinal peppermint extends to ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and imperial China, all specifically noting digestive applications, which is precisely where the most conclusive modern evidence has landed. The farmer's market was not a wellness destination. It was an imprecisely regulated pharmacy that happened to be right about the mechanism. Number 7, sprinkling cinnamon on your breakfast and calling it diabetes. Prevention sounds like the nutritional equivalent of magical thinking. The kind of claim you find on a health food store chalkboard next to a smoothie that costs $14 and contains 3 ingredients your body cannot identify. Except cinnamon contains bioactive compounds that have demonstrated measurable effects on blood glucose regulation through multiple distinct biological pathways, and the clinical research is substantial enough to be taken seriously by endocrinologists who are not in the business of indulging wishful thinking. The primary mechanism involves compounds in cinnamon, particularly cinnamaldehyde and A-type procyanidins, that enhance insulin sensitivity at the cellular level. They increase the expression of glucose transporter proteins on cell membranes, allowing cells to take up glucose from the bloodstream more efficiently, even when insulin signaling is impaired, as it is in type 2 diabetes. Cinnamon also inhibits alpha-glucosidase enzymes in the small intestine, the same enzymes targeted by a class of pharmaceutical diabetes medications called alpha-glucosidase inhibitors. This inhibition slows carbohydrate digestion, blunting the post-meal blood glucose spike that causes long-term vascular damage. A study published in Diabetes Care in 2003 found that 1, 3, or 6 grams of cinnamon daily significantly reduced fasting blood glucose, triglycerides, and LDL cholesterol in type 2 diabetic patients after 40 days. Multiple meta-analyses have since confirmed that cinnamon supplementation produces statistically significant reductions in fasting blood glucose, with typical reductions of 10 to 29 milligrams per deciliter depending on baseline levels and study duration, which is a clinically relevant magnitude, not a rounding error. An important distinction exists between Ceylon cinnamon and cassia cinnamon, the variety most commonly sold in supermarkets. Cassia contains significant amounts of coumarin, which is toxic to the liver in large quantities. Most clinical studies use Ceylon. This distinction matters enormously for both efficacy and safety and is almost never communicated on any product label anywhere. Traditional use of cinnamon for metabolic and digestive complaints is documented in ancient Chinese medical texts, Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia, and medieval European herbalism, all independently noting its regulation of metabolic function in terms that map remarkably well to glycemic control. Cinnamon was managing blood sugar in Ayurvedic practice while Western medicine was still debating far more basic questions. It did not need validation. It was waiting for the right study designed to catch up. Number 8. Chewing on tree bark for pain relief is the kind of prehistoric behavior we are supposed to have graduated from as a species. We have white tablets now. We have blister packs. We have entire pharmaceutical supply chains. There are people in buildings with advanced degrees whose entire professional identity is devoted to ensuring you never have to interact with tree bark again, except willow bark is not folk medicine in the sense of charming, ineffective tradition. It is the literal, direct historical and chemical ancestor of aspirin, one of the most widely consumed drugs in human history. And the pharmaceutical industry did not replace it, it copied it. Willow bark contains salicin, a glycoside that the body metabolizes into salicylic acid. Salicylic acid inhibits prostaglandin synthesis, the exact same mechanism through which aspirin reduces pain, fever, and inflammation. Aspirin is a chemically modified, more bioavailable version of the compound found in willow bark. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to approximately 1500 BCE, documents the use of willow leaves for fever and pain. Hippocrates recommended willow bark tea for fever and the pain of childbirth in the 5th century BCE. The Romans used it. Medieval European herbalists used it. This is not isolated cultural coincidence. This is universal empirical observation across civilizations that never communicated with each other. In 1763, Reverend Edward Stone submitted a formal letter to the Royal Society of London describing the successful use of powdered willow bark to treat fever in approximately 50 patients over 5 years. One of the earliest controlled case series in what would become modern pharmacological investigation. The active compound salicin was isolated by chemists in the 1820s. French chemist Charles Gerhardt synthesized acetyl salicylic acid in 1853. Felix Hoffmann at Bayer refined the formulation in 1897, and aspirin was patented and commercialized. The trajectory from bark to billion-dollar drug took roughly 3,400 years. Clinical trials comparing willow bark extract to conventional non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs for lower back pain and osteoarthritis have found comparable analgesic effects, with some evidence of fewer gastrointestinal side effects, possibly because the slower metabolic conversion is gentler on the gut lining. Willow bark also contains polyphenols and flavonoids beyond salicin that may contribute additional effects not replicated in pure aspirin. The entire global aspirin market is an empire built on a compound that ancient Egyptians found in a tree. They called it folk medicine. Bayer called it a patent. Same molecule. Considerably better marketing. Number 9. Cranberry juice as a urinary tract infection remedy is so deeply embedded in popular health culture that it practically comes with a pink label and a preemptive eye roll from every physician who has heard it mentioned across a clinic desk. The remedy has been dismissed, defended, and confused in equal measure for decades. The dismissal, it turns out, was based on testing the wrong mechanism entirely, which is a different kind of scientific failure than the folk remedy being wrong. The long-standing belief was that cranberry acidifies the urine, creating an inhospitable environment for bacteria. This is incorrect. You cannot meaningfully change urine pH through diet in a way that prevents bacterial growth. Early studies testing this specific hypothesis found no support, and the remedy was broadly dismissed on those grounds, which was the wrong conclusion drawn from the right experiment. The actual mechanism involves proanthocyanidins, specifically A-type proanthocyanidins unique to cranberries and very few other fruits. These compounds bind to the fimbriae of Escherichia coli bacteria, the hair-like attachment structures, physically preventing them from adhering to the cells lining the urinary tract. Bacteria that cannot attach cannot colonize. Bacteria that cannot colonize get flushed out during normal urinary function. Adherence is the critical first step in urinary tract infection pathogenesis. E. Coli accounts for approximately 80 to 85% of all urinary tract infections. A compound that specifically blocks E. coli adherence to bladder tissue is, by definition, a prevention mechanism. This is molecular biology, not grandmother mythology. The clinical picture is nuanced in an important way. Multiple meta-analyses support cranberry products for prevention of recurrent urinary tract infections, particularly in women with a history of frequent infections, but the evidence for treating an active infection is considerably weaker. Cranberry is a prophylactic, not an antibiotic. This distinction is clinically significant and almost never communicated clearly to the public. Standard cranberry juice cocktails contain insufficient proanthocyanidin concentration to achieve the anti-adherence effect demonstrated in laboratory studies. Concentrated extracts standardized to proanthocyanidin content are substantially more likely to deliver a meaningful dose, which explains why individual experiences vary so wildly. A 2012 Cochrane review found evidence supporting cranberry products for recurrence reduction in susceptible women. American Urological and Gynecological Associations now include cranberry as a reasonable prevention option for appropriate patients. Grandmothers were recommending it correctly. Science spent decades arguing about the wrong explanation before eventually confirming the right result. Number 10. Soaking in a bathtub of oatmeal is the kind of treatment that sounds like either an ancient ritual or what exhausted parents do during a chickenpox outbreak when they have run out of better ideas. It does not sound like dermatology, it sounds like breakfast applied externally. Except colloidal oatmeal, finely ground oats suspended in water, is an FDA-recognized active skin protectant ingredient with documented mechanisms of action that address multiple simultaneous causes of skin irritation, and the regulatory designation is not a participation trophy. In 2003, the United States Food and Drug Administration officially classified colloidal oatmeal as a safe and effective over-the-counter skin protectant. This is a designation with specific requirements. It means the agency reviewed the evidence and determined the ingredient has demonstrated efficacy. This is federal regulatory acknowledgement, not a wellness endorsement. The bioactive components responsible include beta-glucans, long-chain polysaccharides that form a protective film on skin, reducing the rate at which moisture escapes, and avenanthramides, phenolic alkaloids unique to oats that have specific anti-inflammatory and antihistamine properties. Avenanthramides inhibit the release of pro-inflammatory cytokines and suppress the activation of NF-kappa B in skin cells, the same master inflammatory regulator discussed earlier. They also suppress histamine-induced itch responses, which explains the documented antipruritic effect in clinical settings. That is the mechanism behind the chickenpox bath. Multiple randomized controlled trials in patients with atopic dermatitis have found that colloidal oatmeal preparations significantly improve skin barrier function, reduce transepidermal water loss, decrease itch scores, and reduce disease severity ratings compared to standard emollients. These are instrument-measured, blinded clinical results, not patient satisfaction surveys. Colloidal oatmeal is now a standard ingredient in prescription-adjacent dermatological formulations for major pharmaceutical skincare companies and appears in pediatric rash management guidelines for diaper rash and heat rash. The historical record of oatmeal baths extends to ancient Roman and Greek medicine, where oats were applied topically for skin complaints. North American folk medicine documented the practice extensively, particularly for childhood infectious rashes, applications where the anti-itch mechanism is directly relevant. Beyond acute conditions, regular colloidal oatmeal use improves chronic skin barrier function with measurable improvements in ceramide levels, the lipid molecules that maintain the structural integrity of the skin's protective outer layer. The chickenpox oatmeal bath your parents gave you was unintentionally delivering avenanthramides directly to your inflamed skin via a food that costs almost nothing. Dermatologists now package the same mechanism in a branded cream and charge accordingly. Number 11, snapping a leaf off an aloe plant and rubbing the gel on a sunburn feels very close to rubbing a leaf on a sunburn, which sounds like what you do in the absence of real medicine rather than as an alternative to it. Decorative, botanical, placebo adjacent at best. Except aloe vera gel contains a documented pharmacological toolkit that addresses burn and wound healing through multiple simultaneous pathways, and the clinical evidence is robust enough that it appears in formal wound care settings across multiple countries. Aloe vera gel contains over 75 potentially active compounds, including acemanin, a complex polysaccharide, vitamin C and E, zinc, and multiple anti-inflammatory enzymes, including bradykinin, which directly degrades bradykinin, one of the primary chemical mediators of pain and inflammation in tissue injury. That is not a plant doing something vague. That is a plant delivering a specific enzyme that degrades a specific pain compound at the wound site. Acemanin has demonstrated immune-modulating properties, including stimulating macrophage activity at wound sites, which accelerates the debridement of damaged tissue and the initiation of the proliferative healing phase. It essentially advances the wound healing sequence forward in time. A systematic review and meta-analysis published in the journal Burns found that aloe vera preparations significantly reduced burn wound healing time compared to conventional dressings, with some trials showing reductions of several days for first and second degree burns. For sunburn specifically, aloe delivers antioxidants directly to UV damaged cells, reduces transepidermal water loss from compromised skin, and the bradykininase activity reduces the acute inflammatory pain response. 3 distinct jobs running simultaneously. Acemanin's properties have attracted research interest in wound healing for diabetic foot ulcers, notoriously slow to heal due to impaired immune and vascular responses, with early clinical results showing accelerated healing compared to standard wound care alone. Ancient Egyptians called aloe the plant of immortality and used it in both embalming and skin preparations. Alexander the Great reportedly secured the island of Socotra to supply his troops with aloe for wound treatment. Traditional Chinese, Indian, and Caribbean medicine all document independent applications for burns and skin conditions. Commercial pharmaceutical wound care products incorporating stabilized aloe vera gel are now formally approved medical devices in multiple countries. The aloe plant on your windowsill requires no electricity, no prescription, and approximately zero maintenance. Civilizations across 5 continents figured this out without a clinical trial. Science just needed to count the compounds and issue a journal citation. Number 12. Elderberry syrup has the slightly mystical reputation of something sold in apothecaries next to dried herbs and advice about moon phases, medieval flavored, aggressively botanical, and definitely not something a virologist would take seriously between conference presentations. Yet elderberry preparations have genuine immunological mechanisms, and randomized controlled trials have demonstrated measurable reductions in the duration and severity of influenza and cold symptoms in ways that are difficult to dismiss once you actually read the studies. Black elderberry contains high concentrations of anthocyanins, specifically cyanidin-3 glucoside and cyanidin-3 sambubioside. which are potent antioxidant flavonoids. More specifically relevant to infection, these compounds have demonstrated direct antiviral activity in cell culture studies, binding to and inhibiting the surface proteins that influenza viruses use to enter respiratory cells. That is an antiviral mechanism, not a general immune pep talk. A randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial published in the Journal of International Medical Research found that elderberry syrup reduced influenza duration by an average of 4 days compared to placebo, with faster recovery across multiple symptom severity measures. A 2016 randomized controlled trial published in Nutrients studied elderberry supplementation in air travelers, a population at elevated infection risk due to crowding and recirculated air, and found significantly reduced cold duration by approximately 2 days and lower severity scores compared to placebo. A 2019 meta-analysis published in Complementary Therapies in Medicine pooled data from multiple trials and concluded that elderberry substantially reduced upper respiratory symptoms, supporting its use as a reasonable alternative to antibiotics for viral infections where antibiotics are ineffective but frequently and inappropriately prescribed. The immunostimulatory mechanism includes increasing the production of specific cytokines that activate immune cells and recruit them to sites of viral infection. European folk medicine, Native American traditional medicine, and traditional medicine across parts of North Africa all independently documented elderberry for fevers and respiratory infections. The convergence across completely isolated traditions is a meaningful biological signal. The raw, unripe berry contains a compound that can cause nausea and vomiting. Cooking eliminates it, which means the ancestral instruction to prepare it correctly was embedding safety chemistry into the recipe before chemistry had a name. Elderberry syrup was doing legitimate antiviral work during centuries when medicine consisted largely of less effective options. 4 clinical trials later, the rustic syrup has a better evidence base than a considerable portion of the supplement aisle. Number 13. Green tea as a health intervention is beloved by wellness culture to the point of gentle self-parody. Consumed while journaling in notebooks and speaking softly about reducing one's cortisol. This association with a certain lifestyle aesthetic has done substantial damage to the compound's scientific credibility among people who judge chemistry by its social media presence. Green tea contains one of the most extensively studied polyphenolic compounds in nutritional science, with documented effects on metabolic rate, cardiovascular risk markers, and neurological health that hold up under scrutiny from researchers who care nothing about the lifestyle angle. The primary bioactive compound is epigallocatechin gallate, which constitutes 50 to 80% of the total catechin content of green tea. This compound inhibits an enzyme called catechol-O-methyltransferase, which normally breaks down norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter and hormone involved in thermogenesis, which is the body's heat-generating calorie-burning process. By inhibiting this enzyme, the catechin extends norepinephrine signaling, increasing the rate at which fat cells release fatty acids for energy use. A meta-analysis published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that green tea catechins combined with caffeine significantly increased 24-hour energy expenditure by 3 to 4% and fat oxidation by approximately 17% compared to the placebo. These are statistically significant metabolic effects. Cardiovascular evidence is compelling at the population level. Large-scale studies in Japan, where green tea consumption is high and measurable, have found inverse associations between green tea intake and cardiovascular disease mortality, with dose-response relationships suggesting causality. Epigallocatechin gallate has demonstrated neuroprotective properties in laboratory models, inhibiting the aggregation of amyloid beta and tau protein, the molecular hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. Human clinical trials in this domain are ongoing, but the biological plausibility is strong enough to sustain serious research funding. Green tea also contains L-theanine. an amino acid that produces calm alertness by increasing alpha brainwave activity and modulating GABA receptors, while blunting the anxiety-inducing edge of caffeine. The caffeine-theanine synergy is one of the best-studied nutrient interactions effects in psychopharmacology. Traditional Chinese medicine documented green tea for at least 3,000 years. Epigallocatechin gallate is now under investigation as an adjunct to cancer therapy. The compound did not change. Only the company it kept changed, and it deserves better company than the people currently putting it in a $30 facial serum. Number 14, lavender for anxiety is the aromatherapy pitch that arrives, bundled with a bath bomb and a decorative item about self-care, scented candles as psychiatric treatment, retail therapy rebranded as neuroscience. Clearly not something that belongs in a clinical conversation about actual anxiety disorders. Except linalool and linaloyl acetate, the primary volatile compounds in lavender oil, interact with GABA-A receptors in the central nervous system, the same receptor system targeted by benzodiazepine anti-anxiety medications. They act as positive allosteric modulators, enhancing the inhibitory effect of GABA, the brain's primary calming neurotransmitter, which reduces neuronal excitability and produces anxiolytic and sedative effects. An oral lavender oil preparation has been evaluated in multiple randomized controlled trials against both placebo and pharmaceutical comparators. A trial published in Phytomedicine found this preparation comparable to lorazepam, a pharmaceutical benzodiazepine, for generalized anxiety disorder with superior tolerability and no sedation, addiction potential, or withdrawal symptoms associated with it. That is a meaningful clinical result by any standard. This oral lavender preparation is approved as a prescription medication for anxiety in Germany, which has rigorous pharmaceutical standards and is not known for handing out drug licenses as compliments. It makes lavender one of the very few traditionally used botanicals to complete the clinical trial process required for pharmaceutical licensing in a major regulatory jurisdiction. Inhalation studies, the aromatherapy route, have demonstrated measurable reductions in cortisol levels, heart rate, and self-reported anxiety in controlled settings, including preoperative anxiety in surgical patients waiting for procedures. The mechanism for inhaled lavender involves olfactory nerve stimulation that activates limbic system pathways with direct connections to the amygdala. Sleep quality studies using lavender inhalation in controlled conditions have shown significant improvements in time to fall asleep, sleep duration, and disrupted sleep measurements, effects that align precisely with the GABA-A receptor mechanism and the reduction in central nervous system excitability. Traditional use of lavender for calming sleep and nervous complaints is documented across Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, and European folk medicine. The distinction between bath bomb lavender and oral lavender preparations is enormous. One delivers mood-adjacent effects through scent, the other delivers pharmacologically relevant concentrations into systemic circulation. The bath bomb crowd was directionally correct. They just needed a capsule and a German regulatory filing to complete the argument. Number 15. The idea that eating deliberately fermented food, yogurt, kimchi, kefir, sauerkraut, does something genuinely meaningful for your health sounds like the gastrointestinal version of an acquired taste in both flavor and credulity. Aggressively preserved, biologically speculative, the kind of dietary habit that requires a longer explanation than anyone at a dinner table wants to hear. Except the gut microbiome is now considered by many researchers to be functionally a separate organ system, and fermented foods are among the most evidence-supported dietary interventions for modulating it in measurable, health-relevant ways. A landmark study published in Cell in 2021 randomized participants to either a high-fiber diet or a high-fermented food diet and found the fermented food group showed significantly increased microbiome diversity and decreased markers of systemic inflammation, including reductions in 19 inflammatory proteins compared to the high-fiber group. This is a top-tier journal, a rigorously designed trial, and a result that surprised even the researchers running it. The gut microbiome Estimated at approximately 38 trillion microbial cells in a typical human body, roughly equal to the total number of human cells, produces neurotransmitters including approximately 90% of the body's serotonin, short-chain fatty acids that fuel gut lining cells, vitamins including K2 and B12, and compounds that directly regulate immune system calibration. Short-chain fatty acids, primarily butyrate, propionate, and acetate, serve as the primary fuel source for colonocytes, reduce intestinal permeability that contributes to systemic inflammation, and regulate immune cell differentiation in ways that affect disease risk across multiple body systems. Clinical evidence supports fermented food interventions for specific conditions. Probiotic supplementation has shown evidence for reducing antibiotic-associated diarrhea, managing irritable bowel syndrome symptoms, reducing severity of ulcerative colitis, and supporting immune function in immunocompromised populations. Traditional fermentation practices appear in every food culture globally. Korean kimchi, Eastern European kefir, Japanese miso, Indian lassi, Middle Eastern labneh, Scandinavian fermented dairy. The universal independent development of fermentation across completely isolated food cultures is a biologically meaningful signal that humans were observing consistent health effects before microbiology existed. The gut-brain axis. Bidirectional communication between the gut's own nervous system and the central brain means microbiome composition directly influences mood, anxiety, and stress response. Every culture on Earth independently figured out how to deliberately ferment food and kept doing it for thousands of years. Modern science named the mechanism and published it in Cell. The kimchi was already in the refrigerator. Number 16, St. John's wort as an antidepressant sounds like herbal shopping for people who distrust psychiatrists. Folk medicine's soft focus answer to a condition that requires actual pharmaceutical intervention, prescribed by someone in a flowing cardigan rather than a medical license. Yellow flowers as mental health treatment. Except St. John's wort has more clinical trial evidence supporting its efficacy for mild to moderate depression than some prescription antidepressants routinely written on pads today, and the comparison is specifically acknowledged in major clinical guidelines by people who are not in the business of being generous to botanicals. The primary active compounds are hypericin and hyperforin. Hyperforin inhibits the reuptake of serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, GABA, and glutamate simultaneously. A broader reuptake inhibition profile than most pharmaceutical antidepressants, which typically target one or two neurotransmitter systems. The mechanism is distinct from but pharmacologically coherent with the mechanisms of SSRIs and SNRIs. A systematic review published in the Cochrane database analyzing 29 clinical trials involving over 5,000 patients concluded that St. John's wort extracts were superior to placebo and similarly effective to standard antidepressants for mild to moderate depression with significantly fewer side effects. This review was updated and reaffirmed multiple times and remains one of the most comprehensive analyses in botanical pharmacology. Critically, the evidence is specifically for mild to moderate depression. For severe depression, clinical trials have not demonstrated superiority over placebo, and standard pharmaceutical treatment is clearly indicated. This is not a universal claim, it is a defined evidence window. Germany's Commission E, the governmental scientific body that evaluates botanical medicines, approved St. John's wort for the treatment of mild to moderate depression, anxiety, and sleep disturbances, and German physicians prescribe it more commonly than SSRIs for mild depression. The critical clinical caveat is the drug interaction profile. The active compound is a potent inducer of enzymes that significantly reduces the blood concentration of numerous co-administered drugs, including medications for transplant rejection prevention, HIV treatment, oral contraceptives, and blood thinners. Transplant rejections and HIV treatment failures have been documented in patients who added St. John's wort without telling their physicians. This interaction is serious, well documented, and the primary reason it requires medical supervision rather than unsupervised self-treatment. The plant treated mild depression across European folk medicine for centuries, was dismissed as mysticism, and then generated a 29-trial Cochrane review confirming it works for exactly what people were using it for. The evidence was always going to be there. It just took the review process several centuries to catch up. Number 17, smearing vapor rub on a congested child's chest or inhaling eucalyptus steam is the kind of folk medicine ritual that feels more like a grandparental comfort performance than actual respiratory treatment. Pungent, nostalgic, and probably doing nothing that 10 minutes of fresh air would not accomplish more elegantly. The primary active compound in eucalyptus is 1,8-cineol, also known as eucalyptol, and it is a pharmacologically active terpene with documented bronchodilatory, mucolytic, and anti-inflammatory effects that are now incorporated into mainstream respiratory medicine in ways that do not require any qualification about being natural. 1,8-cineol directly relaxes the smooth muscle of bronchial airways, increasing airway diameter and reducing the work of breathing in conditions like asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and acute bronchitis. This bronchodilatory effect has been measured in spirometry studies and is statistically significant compared to placebo. Not a subjective impression of breathing more easily, but an objective measurement of airway diameter. A randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial published in Respiratory Medicine in 2003 found that 200 milligrams of oral cineol 3 times daily significantly reduced symptoms and exacerbation frequency in patients with steroid-dependent asthma, and allowed a measurable reduction in corticosteroid doses. Eucalyptol is a primary active ingredient in a pharmaceutical preparation approved in Germany for the treatment of acute bronchitis and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, prescribed and dispensed through regular pharmacy channels as a standard pharmaceutical product. The mucolytic effect, reducing mucus viscosity to improve airway clearance, involves the inhibition of goblet cell mucus secretion and modulation of mucociliary clearance rates. Both the bronchodilatory and mucolytic effects work simultaneously, making breathing easier and clearing pathogen-laden secretions more efficiently at the same time. Topical eucalyptus application, as in vapor rubs, primarily works through cold receptor activation. 1,8-cineol activates temperature receptors in the nasal passages, creating the sensation of increased airflow without actually changing nasal dimensions. Real pharmacological effect, different mechanism from systemic inhalation. Indigenous Australian Aboriginal communities used eucalyptus leaves medicinally for thousands of years before European contact, specifically for respiratory complaints, making this one of the longest documented folk medicine applications for a specific organ system with a confirmed molecular mechanism. Beyond respiratory use, cineol has demonstrated antimicrobial activity against multiple respiratory pathogens. The vapor rub ritual was delivering a licensed pharmaceutical compound to airways and cold receptors simultaneously. Your grandmother did not know the mechanism. Germany's pharmaceutical board eventually did. Number 18, taking zinc lozenges at the first sign of a cold occupies the uncertain middle ground between real medicine and optimistic supplement behavior, hopeful, possibly ineffective, carrying the faint embarrassment of having bought something at a pharmacy that is displayed next to products of significantly less scientific credibility. Zinc ionophore activity in the nasal mucosa is a documented antiviral mechanism, and the clinical evidence for zinc acetate lozenges reducing cold duration is among the strongest in the entire nutritional supplement evidence base when the correct formulation is actually studied correctly. Zinc ions directly inhibit rhinovirus replication in the nasal mucosa, the primary site of cold virus entry and multiplication. The mechanism involves zinc ions binding to the viral coat protein and blocking the attachment step that allows rhinovirus to infect nasal epithelial cells. This is a specific antiviral mechanism, not a vague claim about immune support. The delivery format is pharmacologically critical. Zinc must be in ionic form, available from zinc acetate and zinc gluconate lozenges, and must make direct contact with nasal mucosa through natural drainage after dissolution in the mouth. Swallowed zinc tablets deliver zinc to the gut, but not to the nasal tissue where the action needs to happen. This explains the wildly inconsistent clinical trial results across decades of research. Different formulations produce genuinely different outcomes, and conflating them in a meta-analysis produces confusion rather than clarity. A meta-analysis analyzing high-dose zinc acetate lozenge trials specifically found that zinc acetate lozenges reduce cold duration by 42%, from approximately 7 days to approximately 4 days. Timing is essential. Zinc must be administered within 24 hours of symptom onset, ideally within the first several hours, to interrupt viral replication before it reaches its exponential phase. Waiting 2 days produces negligible benefit. This timing dependence explains the majority of self-reports claiming zinc did nothing. Zinc deficiency, prevalent in a significant portion of the global population, particularly in elderly populations, is independently associated with impaired immune function and increased susceptibility to respiratory infections. The World Health Organization recommends zinc supplementation as a treatment for childhood diarrhea in developing countries, one of the most evidence-based nutritional interventions in global health policy. Zinc works. It works within a narrow delivery window with a specific formulation applied to a specific anatomical target. The compound is not the problem. The instructions most people never receive are. Number 19. Deliberately not eating for extended periods as a health strategy sounds like it was invented by someone trying to make deprivation feel sophisticated. Hunger rebranded as a wellness practice, starvation repackaged as optimization. The nutritional equivalent of paying for discomfort and calling it a protocol. Except controlled fasting triggers a specific conserved cellular maintenance process called autophagy that has been studied intensively enough to generate a Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine, and the health implications are being actively explored across multiple serious disease domains by researchers who are not interested in lifestyle branding. Autophagy, from the Greek for self-eating, is the process by which damaged organelles, misfolded proteins, and dysfunctional cellular components are broken down and recycled within cells. It is a quality control and recycling system operating at the molecular level continuously, and its activity level is regulated by the energy state of the cell. In 2016, Japanese cell biologist Yoshinori Osumi was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine specifically for elucidating the mechanisms of autophagy, one of the most significant biological discoveries of the past 3 decades, and one that arrived largely from asking questions about what happens when cells are stressed by nutrient deprivation. Autophagy is upregulated by energy deprivation. When cellular glucose and insulin levels drop, as occurs during fasting, the energy-sensing enzyme AMPK is activated, which in turn inhibits mTOR, the primary suppressor of autophagy. Removing this brake allows cells to initiate large-scale internal recycling of damaged components that would otherwise accumulate. Impaired autophagy is mechanistically linked to the pathological protein aggregations characteristic of Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and certain cancers. Enhancing autophagy through fasting is being investigated as a potential intervention for neurodegenerative disease prevention. Intermittent fasting protocols have been validated in human clinical trials for improvements in insulin sensitivity, blood glucose regulation, triglycerides, blood pressure, and inflammatory markers beyond what caloric restriction alone explains. Traditional fasting practices appear across virtually every major religious and cultural tradition globally, representing independently arrived at behavioral patterns that may have incidentally delivered autophagy-mediated cellular maintenance benefits across populations for millennia. Religious traditions told people to fast for spiritual reasons. Molecular biologists discovered it triggers cellular quality control systems and issued a Nobel Prize from studying it. The cellular cleanup was happening either way. The theology just provided a scheduling system for a mechanism the body already knew how to run. Number 20. The probiotic industry has wrapped live bacteria in yogurt containers and pill capsules and marketed them with imagery of glowing adults who appear to have never experienced a digestive complaint in their lives. This is either medicine or the most aggressively optimistic food marketing in modern commercial history. The science is messier and considerably more interesting than either the marketing or the reflexive skepticism suggests, and the clinical evidence is strong enough in specific applications to matter far beyond the general wellness category. Approximately 70 to 80% of the immune system's cellular infrastructure is located in and around the gut, in structures called Peyer's patches and the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. This anatomical fact makes the gut the largest immune organ in the body and means that anything meaningfully affecting gut microbial composition can influence systemic immune function in ways that extend well beyond digestion. Specific strains with the strongest evidence base include Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG, extensively studied for reducing duration of childhood diarrhea and antibiotic-associated diarrhea, and Bifidobacterium lactis, shown to increase natural killer cell activity. Strain specificity is not a marketing distinction, it is a biological reality. Two products with different strains are genuinely different interventions, regardless of what the label category says. A 2011 Cochrane review of 63 randomized controlled trials found that probiotics reduced antibiotic-associated diarrhea by approximately 42% compared to placebo, with the evidence strongest for specific well-characterized strains. In preterm neonates, a population at extreme risk from life-threatening, necrotizing enterocolitis, specific probiotic supplementation has demonstrated significant reductions in disease incidence and associated mortality in meta-analyses. This is one of the highest stakes and best controlled clinical applications of probiotics in medicine. Fecal microbiota transplantation, the transfer of complete microbiome communities from healthy donors to patients, has achieved reported success rates above 90% for recurrent Clostridioides difficile infection, the most antibiotic-resistant gut infection in developed world medicine, and is now regulated by the FDA as a biological product. Live bacteria as medicine sounds wrong until you remember your immune system lives next door to them and takes their molecular signals constantly. The mistake is not using probiotics. It is buying the cheapest generic product and expecting pharmaceutical grade results from bacteria optimized for production cost rather than clinical outcome. Number 21. Chamomile tea before bed is the folklorically gentle suggestion made by every mother who could not explain why it might help. The botanical equivalent of a warm blanket recommendation, impossibly mild, definitely not pharmacology. Except chamomile contains a compound called apigenin that binds to benzodiazepine receptors in the brain with documented anxiolytic and sedative effects, and clinical trials have demonstrated measurable improvements in generalized anxiety disorder and insomnia that go well beyond the comfort of a warm drink. Apigenin is a flavonoid that binds to GABA-A receptors at the benzodiazepine binding site, the same receptor site targeted by diazepam, lorazepam, and other pharmaceutical anti-anxiety medications. Apigenin acts as a partial agonist at this site, producing anxiolytic and mild sedative effects without the full receptor activation that produces dependence and tolerance in pharmaceutical benzodiazepines. That distinction matters clinically for a medication class that has generated enormous addiction burden. A randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial published in the Journal of Clinical Psychopharmacology in 2009 studied chamomile extract in patients with generalized anxiety disorder over 8 weeks and found statistically significant reductions in anxiety scores compared to placebo with a good safety and tolerability profile throughout the trial. A follow-up long-term study by the same research group published in 2017 found that chamomile extract significantly reduced relapse rates in patients who had responded to initial treatment, meaning it demonstrated sustained protective effects over time rather than just acute symptom relief. For insomnia, a randomized controlled trial in postnatal women found that chamomile tea consumption over 2 weeks significantly improved sleep quality and depression scores compared to control. A separate trial in elderly participants found measurable improvements in sleep efficiency, a population where pharmaceutical sleep aids carry significant fall and cognitive side effect risks. Chamomile also contains bisabolol and chamazoline, terpenoid compounds primarily responsible for chamomile's topical anti-inflammatory and wound-healing applications, creating a broader pharmacological profile beyond the GABA-mediated effects. Greek, Roman, and Egyptian medical traditions all documented chamomile for calming, sleep, and digestive complaints, with a consistency of indication that aligns precisely with the modern receptor-level mechanism. Apigenin is also found in parsley, celery, artichokes, and citrus, suggesting traditional diets incorporating these foods may have delivered low-level GABA-A modulation through routine eating. The chamomile tea was not a symbolic ritual. It was a low-dose benzodiazepine site agonist in an edible format. Number 22. Valerian root is the herbal sleep remedy that has existed in pharmacies long enough to be considered part of the furniture, old enough to predate brand recognition, distinctive enough in its aroma to suggest it might actually be doing something, and taken seriously by roughly no one who has not tried it out of desperation. Valerian contains multiple compounds with documented GABAergic, adenosinergic, and serotonergic mechanisms that collectively make it one of the most pharmacologically complex botanical sedatives studied, and its clinical evidence for sleep quality improvement is among the strongest of any non-pharmaceutical sleep intervention. The primary mechanisms involve valerianic acid, which inhibits GABA transaminase, the enzyme that breaks down GABA, thereby increasing GABA concentrations in synaptic spaces and enhancing inhibitory neurotransmission throughout the central nervous system. Isovaleric acid appears to modulate GABA-A receptor activity directly. Multiple compounds work synergistically, which is why valerian extract performs differently from isolated valerianic acid in some studies, and why formulation quality varies enough to explain inconsistent results across the research literature. A meta-analysis published in the American Journal of Medicine analyzed 16 randomized controlled trials and concluded that valerian may improve sleep quality without producing meaningful side effects, with the effect more consistent for subjective sleep quality than for objective sleep latency measures. Valerian has also demonstrated adenosine receptor affinity. Adenosine is the neurotransmitter that accumulates during wakefulness and drives sleep pressure, the same mechanism that caffeine blocks. Compounds that enhance adenosinergic signaling accelerate the subjective drive towards sleep without requiring sedative-level central nervous system depression. Valerian has been used medicinally since the time of Galen in the 2nd century. It was used as an anti-anxiety treatment during World War II air raids in Britain, where civilian sleep disruption and stress were significant public health problems affecting functional capacity. Unlike pharmaceutical sedatives, valerian shows no evidence of tolerance development, physical dependence, or hangover effect in clinical trial populations. Properties that are meaningful given the enormous clinical and societal costs of benzodiazepine dependence affecting millions of people worldwide. Combination preparations of valerian with lemon balm, which also has GABAergic and anxiolytic mechanisms, have shown particularly strong results in randomized trials, with the combination outperforming either herb individually. Valerian root smells like a gymnasium used exclusively by a medieval herbalist. The GABA transaminase inhibition it delivers does not care what it smells like, neither should you. Number 23. Licorice as medicine is the kind of claim people associate with candy jars in old pharmacies, where everything tasted either medicinal or suspiciously pleasant. Confectionery adjacent, historical in a dusty way, and unlikely to be doing anything that a modern clinician would recognize as pharmacologically relevant. Glycyrrhizin, the primary active compound in licorice root, has documented anti-inflammatory, antiviral, and gastroprotective properties that have been studied in formal clinical settings, including as a treatment for hepatitis C and peptic ulcer disease, in ways that require no charitable interpretation of the evidence. Glycyrrhizin inhibits an enzyme that normally converts active cortisol to its inactive form in tissues. By inhibiting this enzyme, glycyrrhizin increases local cortisol concentrations, producing anti-inflammatory effects comparable to mild corticosteroid activity without requiring pharmaceutical steroid administration. This same mechanism explains the gastroprotective effects. Increased local cortisol in gastric mucosa enhances protective mucus production, reduces acid secretion, and promotes the healing of peptic ulcers through a recognized pathway. Deglycyrrhizinated licorice, a processed form with glycyrrhizin removed to reduce systemic side effects, is used clinically for peptic ulcer management and has shown significant healing acceleration in controlled trials compared to placebo. Intravenous glycyrrhizin has been studied as a treatment for hepatitis C in Japan and specifically for patients who failed standard antiviral therapy, and has demonstrated reductions in liver enzyme elevations and anti-inflammatory effects on hepatic tissue in clinical use. This is pharmaceutical-grade application of a botanical compound currently in active clinical deployment. For sore throat, licorice root's demulcent properties combined with glycyrrhizin's anti-inflammatory and mild antiviral activity make it biologically coherent. A clinical trial using licorice gargle solution in post-operative patients found significantly reduced sore throat severity compared to water gargle, a result obtained in a controlled surgical context. Traditional Chinese medicine has used licorice root for over 3,000 years, appearing in more traditional formulations than almost any other single botanical. The pharmaceutical derivative carbonoxolone, derived from glycyrrhizin, was one of the first clinically used treatments for peptic ulcer disease before proton pump inhibitors were developed, establishing the direct pharmacological to pharmaceutical trajectory. The safety caveat is substantial. High doses cause serious cardiovascular complications. The compound that makes licorice dangerous in excess is the same compound doing the pharmacological work at therapeutic doses. Medicine has always worked this way. The line between treatment and harm has always been dose. Number 24, rubbing hot pepper extract on painful joints sounds like either a desperate folk remedy or something specifically designed to produce a different, louder pain that distracts from the original complaint. Chilly as analgesia, compensatory rather than therapeutic. Except capsaicin, the active compound in cayenne peppers, has a specific, well-characterized neuropharmacological mechanism for pain relief and is formulated into both prescription and over-the-counter pharmaceutical preparations currently used in clinical pain management without any apology about the origin of the idea. Capsaicin binds to and activates TRPV1 receptors, ion channels expressed on pain-transmitting nociceptive neurons. Initial activation produces the burning sensation that makes people immediately regret their decision. However, sustained or repeated capsaicin exposure causes receptor desensitization and, at high concentrations, depletion of substance P, the primary neuropeptide that transmits pain signals from peripheral nerves to the spinal cord. No substance P, no pain signal transmission. The biology is that direct. A high concentration capsaicin patch containing 8% capsaicin is FDA approved for the treatment of neuropathic pain associated with post-herpetic neuralgia and is applied in clinical settings under physician supervision due to its potency. Lower concentration, over-the-counter topical capsaicin preparations have been evaluated in multiple randomized controlled trials demonstrating significant pain reduction compared to placebo for osteoarthritis, and meta-analyses confirm the consistent effect across trials. The American College of Rheumatology includes topical capsaicin in its treatment recommendations for hand and knee osteoarthritis, a formal guideline endorsement from the relevant specialist body. The heat paradox is pharmacologically explained. Capsaicin activates the same receptor that genuine heat activates, which is why it produces a burning sensation. The brain receives a signal identical to heat contact. Desensitization of this receptor subsequently reduces all types of pain transmitted through those nerve fibers, not just heat pain, which is a mechanism that produces lasting relief after the initial unpleasantness. Capsaicin mechanism is also used in research as a neurological investigative tool, and TRPV1 receptor modulation is being investigated as a therapeutic target for chronic pain, migraine, and visceral hypersensitivity. Traditional medicine use of capsaicin-containing peppers for joint pain, back pain, and headache is documented across Mesoamerican, South American, and Asian traditional medical systems. Rubbing hot pepper on a painful joint sounds wrong until you understand that you are depleting substance P at the nociceptive nerve terminal, which is exactly what the prescription patch in the pain clinic is doing with significantly more paperwork. Number 25. Echinacea supplements are the wellness aisle's most consistently popular and consistently contested product, cited confidently by people who take it and dismissed confidently by people who read one study that found no effect. The appearance of disagreement in the research literature is not because echinacea does not work. It is because the word echinacea has been applied to multiple species, multiple plant parts, multiple preparation methods, and multiple dosing regimens that produce genuinely different pharmacological outcomes. And conflating them in a research summary produces confusion rather than science. The genus Echinacea includes 3 commercially used species: Purpurea, Angustifolia, and Pallida, whose active compound profiles differ significantly. The aerial parts and roots of each species contain different concentrations of alkamides, polysaccharides, glycoproteins, and caffeic acid derivatives, all of which have different immunological activity profiles. Saying Echinacea does not work based on a study of the wrong species or preparation is the botanical equivalent of concluding antibiotics are ineffective after testing the wrong class against the wrong organism. Alkamides from Echinacea purpureae aerial parts are lipophilic and bioavailable. They reach systemic circulation, bind to cannabinoid receptor 2 on immune cells, and modulate macrophage and dendritic cell activity. This is a specific receptor-mediated immunomodulatory mechanism, not a vague suggestion that the immune system might feel encouraged. A Cochrane review analyzing 24 randomized controlled trials with over 4,600 participants concluded that some echinacea preparations decrease the odds of developing a cold and reduced cold duration, with the effects strongest for specific high-quality preparations and preventive use. A large randomized trial published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2005 found no significant effect. But this trial used a non-standardized dried herb preparation now considered methodologically inadequate by botanical pharmacology standards. The trial is widely cited as evidence against echinacea by people who do not read the methods section of the papers they cite. Native American traditional medicine, particularly Plains tribes, documented over 180 traditional applications of Echinacea species, primarily for infections and wound complaints. A Swiss randomized controlled trial in 2021 found that a standardized Echinacea preparation reduced respiratory viral infections by 49% compared to placebo in a prospective community study. The problem was never the plant. It was the industry selling the word on 300 products with 300 different actual contents. Number 26. Ginkgo biloba supplements for brain performance occupy a peculiar position in the cultural conversation. Taken by older adults anxious about memory, referenced vaguely in discussions about cognitive health, and frequently cited as an example of supplement industry excess by skeptical physicians who have stopped reading the relevant literature. Ginkgo biloba extract has documented cerebrovascular mechanisms. It improves blood flow to the brain, acts as a free radical scavenger in neural tissue, and inhibits platelet aggregation. And while cognitive enhancement claims in healthy individuals are modest, its applications in cognitive impairment and circulatory insufficiency have substantially stronger clinical support than the dismissal suggests. The extract contains 2 primary active compound classes, flavonoid glycosides, which act as antioxidants in neural tissue and inhibit platelet activating factor, a mediator of platelet aggregation and neuroinflammation, and terpene lactones, specifically ginkgolides and bilobolide, which improve cerebral microcirculation and have neuroprotective effects against ischemic damage. Ginkgolide B is one of the most potent naturally occurring platelet activating factor antagonists ever identified, comparable in binding affinity to some pharmaceutical inhibitors developed specifically for this target. The standardized extract is licensed in Germany as a prescription medication for symptomatic treatment of cognitive deficits in dementia syndromes, peripheral arterial occlusive disease, and vertigo of vascular origin. A pharmaceutical regulatory approval, not a wellness designation. A large 5-year randomized controlled trial found that the standardized extract did not significantly reduce Alzheimer's disease incidence in cognitively normal older adults. However, multiple other trials examining patients who already had mild cognitive impairment or early dementia have found significant stabilization of cognitive function scores, suggesting the intervention is disease stage-dependent rather than globally ineffective. A 2015 Cochrane review concluded that evidence was consistent with benefits on cognitive function, daily living activities, and neuropsychiatric symptoms in patients with dementia, with the effects described as moderate. Ginkgo is the oldest living tree species on Earth. Individual trees can live over 2,500 years. Chinese traditional medicine has used it for thousands of years, documented in Ming Dynasty Pharmacopoeia. The research trajectory is legitimate, the drug interactions are real and require physician disclosure, and the ancient tree's survival through 4 ice ages is, unfortunately, just good marketing that arrived by coincidence rather than design. Number 27, apple cider vinegar as a cure-all is the internet wellness phenomenon that culminates in someone consuming undiluted acetic acid while posting about their energy levels and complexion simultaneously. The folk remedy that became an influencer product without pausing to consult a laboratory. Except the evidence for apple cider vinegar's specific effects on post-meal blood glucose is scientifically coherent and backed by multiple controlled trials, though the mechanism is understood, the dose is specific, and the broader cure, all claims surrounding it are inflated well beyond what the research actually supports. Acetic acid, the primary active component of all vinegar at roughly 4 to 8% concentration, inhibits salivary and pancreatic amylase enzymes in the digestive tract, reducing the rate of starch digestion and carbohydrate absorption. This produces a measurable blunting of the post-meal blood glucose spike, a physiologically relevant effect for anyone managing metabolic health. A randomized crossover trial published in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that vinegar consumed with a white bread meal significantly reduced post-meal blood glucose and insulin responses in a dose-dependent manner, alongside increased satiety scores. Participants reported feeling fuller for longer, which has implications for subsequent caloric intake. A randomized controlled trial in participants with type 2 diabetes published in Diabetes Care in 2004 found that apple cider vinegar consumed at bedtime significantly improved fasting blood glucose levels the following morning compared to water placebo. The proposed mechanism involves acetate modulating overnight hepatic glucose output, the rate at which the liver releases glucose into the bloodstream during sleep. The clinical research supports a specific use case, consuming 1 to 2 tablespoons of vinegar with or before high carbohydrate meals to attenuate blood glucose excursions. This is a real, documented, mechanistically explained effect. The detoxification claims, cancer prevention assertions, immune-boosting promises, and weight loss guarantees are not supported by evidence at comparable quality levels. Dental erosion from undiluted consumption is a documented clinical problem with the acidity sufficient to demineralize enamel with regular direct contact. Dilution and straw use are dental health necessities, not optional recommendations. Hippocrates documented medicinal vinegar use approximately 2,400 years ago. Apple cider vinegar has a real blood sugar mechanism at a specific dose in a specific context. It is a mild amylase inhibitor that some individuals managing blood glucose should discuss with their physician, which is a considerably less compelling paragraph for a wellness influencer to build a brand around. Number 28. Recommending meditation as a health intervention sounds like the point where medicine gives up and surrenders to self-help culture. Sitting quietly as treatment, breathing intentionally as pharmaceuticals, the wellness industry's most respectable sounding non-answer to conditions that require actual clinical intervention. Mindfulness-based interventions have generated a clinical evidence base substantial enough to be integrated into NHS treatment protocols, oncology supportive care guidelines, and chronic pain management curricula, and the molecular changes they produce are now measurable at the cellular level rather than the subjective experience level. Mindfulness-based stress reduction. The standardized 8-week program developed at the University of Massachusetts Medical School in 1979 has been evaluated in over 200 randomized controlled trials for conditions including chronic pain, depression, anxiety, cancer-related distress, and cardiovascular disease. The evidence base is large enough to generate multiple Cochrane reviews, and the effect sizes for depression and anxiety are clinically significant and comparable to other active treatments in the same categories. Neuroimaging studies using functional MRI have demonstrated measurable structural brain changes in long-term meditators compared to controls. Specifically, increased gray matter density in the left hippocampus, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the temporoparietal junction. These are not subjective reports of feeling calmer. These are physically measurable anatomical differences visible on brain scans. A 2013 study by a research team including Nobel Prize winner Elizabeth Blackburn found that mindfulness practice was associated with increased telomerase activity, the enzyme that maintains and repairs telomere length. Shorter telomeres are associated with cellular aging, inflammation-related disease, and earlier mortality. This is the most direct molecular evidence yet that meditation-induced stress reduction affects cellular aging biology at a measurable level. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis shows measurable downregulation in meditators with lower baseline cortisol levels, blunted cortisol responses to acute stressors, and faster recovery. Because chronic cortisol elevation directly suppresses immune function, promotes atherosclerosis, and impairs memory consolidation, this represents a genuinely health-relevant physiological change. A 2013 study published in Brain, Behavior, and Immunity found that mindfulness training in cancer patients significantly reduced NF-kappa B regulated pro-inflammatory gene expression compared to active control. Direct molecular evidence of anti-inflammatory changes from a behavioral intervention. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is endorsed by the UK's NICE guidelines as a recommended treatment for recurrent depression. The ancient monasteries were running uncontrolled trials for 2,500 years. The randomized controlled trial just needed a few more decades to add the control group. Number 29. Ice on injuries and heat on sore muscles is such foundational folk knowledge that it is taught in elementary school, embedded in every sports kit, and assumed to be unambiguously correct by everyone who has ever applied a bag of frozen peas to a swollen ankle. Surely this one is either obviously right or the entire system of basic health advice is beyond repair. The rules around ice and heat application are more nuanced, more actively contested, and more frequently misapplied than almost anyone currently acknowledges, and the blanket recommendation to ice acute injuries is being significantly revised by the sports medicine researchers who built their entire careers on it. The RICE protocol, rest, ice, compression, elevation, dominated sports medicine for over 4 decades after it was introduced in 1978. In 2014, its creator publicly revised his own protocol, acknowledging that the ice component may delay healing rather than accelerate it, a remarkable self-correction from the person responsible for 4 decades of frozen vegetable application to human anatomy. The mechanism. Acute inflammation following tissue injury is a necessary, purposeful biological process. Inflammatory mediators recruit macrophages and signaling molecules, specifically insulin like growth factor 1, that initiate tissue repair. Ice application dramatically reduces blood flow to the injured area and blunts the acute inflammatory response, which feels beneficial in the short term but may slow the tissue repair cascade that inflammation was initiating in the first place. Recent studies suggest that suppressing the acute inflammatory response with ice in the first 24 to 48 hours after injury may impair the downstream repair and remodeling phases, resulting in slower recovery and potentially weaker tissue formation. Where ice retains uncontested evidence is analgesia. Ice numbs pain effectively through neural conduction blocking. The debate is whether using ice for pain justifies the potential cost to healing biology, and the answer appears to be context and timing dependent. Heat promotes vasodilation and increases blood flow, which is beneficial for subacute and chronic conditions, muscle spasm, chronic stiffness, delayed onset soreness, where increased circulation and improved metabolite clearance accelerate recovery. Heat on acutely inflamed, still swelling injuries worsens edema and increases pain. A revised protocol proposed in the British Journal of Sports Medicine in 2019 explicitly de-emphasizes ice in favor of allowing the inflammatory process to proceed. The traditional folk wisdom distinguishing cold for fresh injuries and heat for chronic stiffness maps onto exactly what sports medicine is formally re-evaluating. The biology cares about the distinction even when the gym bag does not. Number 30, get some sun, you will feel better. The most dispensed piece of unsolicited health advice in the history of human interaction. Obvious, trite. The folk recommendation your neighbor delivers unrequested when you mention you're tired. Probably not doing anything that a vitamin supplement could not handle with considerably less outdoor exposure. Sunlight exposure produces measurable, specific pharmacologically relevant effects on serotonin synthesis, melatonin suppression, and vitamin D production that collectively constitute one of the most powerful environmental health interventions available, and the global vitamin D deficiency epidemic is one of the largest preventable health crises in developed world medicine, hiding in plain sight behind a recommendation so common that no one takes it seriously. Sunlight exposure activates a specific pathway in the eye, entirely distinct from visual processing, where light-sensitive retinal ganglion cells containing a photopigment called melanopsin respond to blue wavelength light and signal directly to the brain's circadian master clock, triggering serotonin synthesis in the raphe nuclei. More sunlight means more serotonin, which means better mood, improved sleep quality, and more robust circadian alignment. Vitamin D synthesis is initiated when ultraviolet B radiation converts a compound in the skin into the precursor of the active form, is critical for health far beyond bone metabolism. Vitamin D receptors are expressed in virtually every tissue in the human body, including immune cells, brain cells, cardiovascular tissue, and pancreatic cells. Vitamin D deficiency is now estimated to affect approximately 1 billion people globally and is prevalent in indoor working, high-latitude populations. Deficiency is associated with increased risk of autoimmune disease, cardiovascular disease, certain cancers, depression, metabolic syndrome, and increased severity of respiratory infections. An extraordinary disease burden attributable to insufficient exposure to a freely available environmental input. Seasonal affective disorder, major depressive episodes following seasonal patterns of reduced light, affects 1 to 10% of populations in northern latitudes and represents direct clinical evidence that light availability has psychiatric consequences. Light therapy is a first-line guideline recommended treatment for this condition, operating through the same melanopsin serotonin pathway. A 2020 meta-analysis in the BMJ found that vitamin D supplementation significantly reduced the risk of acute respiratory infection in deficient individuals. Morning sunlight exposure specifically, within the first 30 to 60 minutes of waking, is now recognized by circadian biologists as the single most powerful tool for synchronizing the human circadian rhythm, affecting energy, mood, alertness, sleep quality, hormone timing, and metabolic function throughout the entire day. Traditional outdoor morning activity appears in virtually every pre-industrial culture globally. The indoor lifestyle was the experiment. The results include 1 billion deficient people. 31. The placebo effect is what scientists cite when they want to politely dismiss a folk remedy without engaging with its specifics. It only works because you believe it does. As if that statement settles the matter, rather than raising the far more interesting question of what exactly is happening in a body that produces measurable relief because it expects to experience measurable relief. The placebo effect is a real, neurobiologically measurable, dose-dependent, trainable physiological phenomenon that produces quantifiable changes in brain chemistry, immune function, hormonal output, and objective clinical outcomes. And dismissing it as just psychology is a failure to understand what psychology is and what it physically does to tissue. Placebo analgesia, pain relief from inert treatments, is mediated by the release of endogenous opioids, specifically beta-endorphin and enkephalins, in specific brain regions involved in pain modulation. This is not subjective. Administering naloxone, an opioid blocker, abolishes placebo analgesia, proving that real opioid receptors are being activated by real neurochemicals triggered by the expectation of relief. The placebo is not doing nothing. It is prompting the brain's own pharmaceutical dispensary to fill a prescription. Placebo effects extend far beyond pain. Sham surgery for Parkinson's disease produced measurable increases in dopamine release in the striatum documented via brain imaging. Placebo bronchodilators produce measurable improvements in lung function in asthma patients. Placebo chemotherapy caused hair loss in controlled trials. The physiology is real in each case. Open-label placebos, where patients are told explicitly they are receiving a sugar pill with no active ingredient, have demonstrated persistent therapeutic effects in randomized controlled trials for irritable bowel syndrome, chronic low back pain, and cancer-related fatigue. This eliminates the deception requirement and suggests that therapeutic context, ritual, and the clinical relationship independently activate neurobiological healing responses even when the patient is fully informed. Placebo responses involve the prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, amygdala, and endogenous opioid, dopamine, and cannabinoid systems, meaning the therapeutic relationship, the ritual of treatment, and the narrative framing of care are direct inputs into biological healing pathways, not decorative additions to the real medicine happening elsewhere. The nocebo effect, where expectation of a harm produces measurable harm through these same pathways, is equally real. Many traditional healing practices incorporate elaborate ritual, strong practitioner-patient relationship, and positive expectation as deliberate therapeutic elements. These were not the ineffective part of the treatment, they were the placebo component running real neurobiology. Folk medicine was, among other things, an expert system for triggering an endogenous pharmacy that modern clinical environments are only beginning to optimize deliberately. Science called it superstition. The endorphins were already doing their job. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.